Saudara, marilah sama-sama kita ikuti siri Crown Court dengan episod bertajuk Peanuts.
Take the book in your right hand, read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty
Would you
God.
remove your gloves, please? You cannot take the oath wearing gloves.
The case you're about to see is fictitious, but the procedure is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the general public. Today in the Crown Court, Mrs. Paula Carline is accused of malicious wounding.
You're Felicity Carline of 12 Silver Grove, Fulchester.
Yes,
And your occupation?
I'm a housewife. Except I'm divorced, but I suppose I'm a sort of housewife.
You have children to look after,
Yes, 2.
but you don't have a proper job.
No.
I can assure you, Mr. Crichton, that being a mother is much harder work than your so-called proper job.
Yes, Your Honour. We will take it that Mrs. Carline works at home. On the 17th of March, did you go out in the evening?
Yes,
Where did you go?
I went to the off-licence Van Ordinaires in Claremont Crescent.
And do you remember at about what time?
Yes, it must have been between 6:30 and 7 because I promised the boys I'd be home for This Is Your Life.
Sorry?
Mrs. Carline, could you repeat what you just said?
We always watched This Is Your Life.
That isn't what you actually said. What you said was, I promised the boys I would be home in time for This Is Your Life.
I'm sorry.
Mrs. Carline, if counsel cannot hear you, it is reasonable to assume that the jury cannot hear you either. Would you please try to speak up?
I'm sorry.
Mrs. Carline, why did you go to the Van Ordinaire?
To buy some champagne.
You were planning a celebration?
Yes, my eldest son, Joseph, had just got into public school, a music scholarship, and I wanted to celebrate.
And while you were buying this champagne, were you alone in the shop?
No, the woman that owned the shop was there, and a strange boy came in to buy some beer. I remember him because his hair was very odd. He asked me if some beer was better in a tin or a bottle. I don't drink beer.
Did anyone enter the shop while you were choosing your champagne?
Yes. Andrew's new wife came in.
Can you tell the court her name, Mrs. Carline?
Paula. Paula, she's married to him, so I suppose it's Carline.
So your former husband's wife came into the shop while you were there?
Yes.
Where does your former husband live?
3 Antimony Crescent.
And is this near you?
Yes, it's on the same estate.
And does Paula Carline live there with him?
Yes. It's her house. She owns it.
Do you and the accused occasionally bump into each other?
Well, not as often as you'd think. Gull Hill's a big estate.
But you had met on occasions previous to the one in the Van Ordinaire?
Yes.
Could you outline to the court these meetings on previous occasions?
Yes.
Your Honour, is this relevant to the case?
Mr. Crichton,
Animosities, Your Honour, animosities can take a long time to build up and come to a head. I would seek to show the court this was the case.
I would accept that, Mr. Fletcher Reed.
As it pleases you, Your Honour.
Mrs. Carline, can you recall previous meetings with the accused?
Yes, I can.
Would you tell the court about them?
Oh, yes. Well, I first met her about 3 years ago when she came with Andrew to take the boys out for some outing. This was before she was married to my former husband. I think it was my younger son Timothy's birthday treat. She was very quiet. She didn't say very much. I thought perhaps she was nervous at meeting the boys for the first time.
And what about meetings after this first one?
Well, I really never got to know her better than a quick cup of coffee whilst the boys were getting their things together. We talked about them mostly. They were really all we had in common. And Andrew, of course.
And did your acquaintance continue in this vein?
No.
Did something happen to change it?
Yes, she stopped coming with Andrew to collect the boys.
Does the children's father have regular access to them?
Oh, yes. He's supposed to have them every other weekend, but he sometimes has to work most weekends. But I like him to have the boys as often as possible, so he sees them during the week if he can. That is, if they don't have any homework or anything like that.
So you didn't see Paula Carline for some time after this, after she stopped coming to the house?
I saw her in the distance, but not to speak to, no.
Were you avoiding her during this period?
Not at all. I had no reason to avoid her, but we had very little in common. There was no particular reason for us to meet.
So when did you and Paula Carline renew your acquaintance?
She started sending me coupons.
Coupons, Mrs.
Yes.
Carline.
Coupons, you know, cut from magazines, money off this and that.
Do you know why she started to save these coupons for you?
No,
She just started to send them to you out of the blue.
she didn't send them to me. She used to put them through the letterbox when the boys were out with Andrew.
Was there a note with them?
No.
How do you know they were from the accused, not from anybody else?
Well, I found her doing it once. I opened the door for the cat and she was there.
And what was the reaction of the accused when you opened the door?
She tried to thrust them into my hand. She said that they would help me to save money and that I ought to save money because the business was going badly.
The business, Mrs. Carline.
The witness's former husband owns 2 news agents, Your Honour.
Thank you, Mr. Crichton.
Did you say anything to Paula Carline when you opened the door?
Yes.
What did you say?
Oh, I don't remember my exact words. But I told her to go away. I asked her not to bring me any more.
And did she?
Well, she didn't ever try to hand them to me, but sometimes they used to come through the letterbox.
I see. And was this meeting on your doorstep the one previous to the one in the Van Ordinaire?
No.
And where did that meeting take place?
In Lodderier's.
Can you tell the court what Lodderier's is?
It's a shoe shop. In the high street, they specialize in Italian shoes.
And when did you and Mrs. Carline meet in Lodderier's shoe shop?
I can't remember the... I think it was the end of January, perhaps the first week in February, but I...
Did you say anything to the accused when you met?
Well, I smiled at her. I really didn't think there was anything to say, particularly after our last meeting.
Did the accused speak to you?
Sort of.
Did Mrs. Carline speak to you, or didn't she, Mrs. Carline?
Mr. Crichton, since we have 2 Mrs. Carlines in the case, I think it would assist the court if you could identify them using their Christian names. Felicity Carline and Paula Carline.
Of course, Your Honour. Mrs. Carline, did Paula Carline say anything when you met in Lodderier's shoe shop?
Well, she didn't say anything to me.
Did she say anything to anybody else?
She said to the assistant, if this bitch can afford shoes like this, why am I paying her maintenance?
And then what happened?
She threw what she was holding onto the floor and she walked out.
And that was the last time you and the accused met before your meeting in the Van Ordinaire?
Yes.
Did the accused notice you when she entered the Van Ordinaire on the 17th of March?
I don't know. I didn't see her come in. The lady behind the counter had asked if I was having a party, and I was telling her what the party was for. I suppose I was being a bit of a boastful mother. She said her niece was very musical. I told her all about the scholarship, what it was worth. Then I realized there was a queue. I turned round, and it was Paula.
And what was your reaction on meeting the accused?
I said I was sorry because I'd kept her waiting. Nothing else. I've always believed in turning the other cheek. Then I went back to writing my check and I left. Well...
Did something happen to prevent you leaving the Van Ordinaire?
Yes.
Perhaps you would tell the court what happened to prevent you leaving the off-licence.
She threw a packet of peanuts at me. In my haste to avoid a confrontation, I'd left them on the counter. She threw them at me. I lost hold of everything. I tried to grab hold of everything, but then the shelves just came away from the walls. You'd think the health people would make sure that shops had their shelves fitted properly so they wouldn't come crashing down on people. Well, the next thing I remember, I was in excruciating pain. Everything was wet. I could feel something dripping down my face. I thought it was alcohol, but it was blood. I knew it was blood because it tasted salty.
And what was the reaction of the accused?
She just walked out of the shop.
After Paula Carline had left?
I don't know. I know somebody asked if I was all right, but I couldn't move. There was all this glass. I didn't like to move. And the pain and the blood, I thought I was going to die.
You must have been in great pain, Mrs. Carline.
Yes. Then the police came. They asked me a lot of questions. I don't know what I said, but I do remember I told them about Paula. I told them what had happened. And then an ambulance came and they put me in it.
And did the ambulance take you to the hospital?
Yes, they took me to the infirmary.
Do you remember what happened when you got there?
Well, they said that they would have to take the glass out of me. I needed an anesthetic. I've got glass in me, you see. You see,
Can the jury see? Perhaps you would like to cross the floor so that the jury can see.
It's horrible.
The jury would have a far better idea of your wounds if they could see them. Mrs. Carline.
Very well. I'm like this all over.
Will you return to the box, please?
Thank you, Mrs. Carline.
How long did you have to stay in the hospital, Mrs. Carline?
Just over 3 weeks.
It seems a long time for cuts.
I had to have surgery. My face.
Is your hospital treatment now finished?
I don't know. I would like something done to my hands to make them look better. It would have to be done privately. Whatever they do, I'm still going to look a mess. I have a problem lifting things, and I've lost the use and feeling in 2 of my fingers. It'll never come back.
Thank you, Mrs. Carline.
Your Honor, in view of Mrs. Carline's injuries, might she perhaps be permitted to sit down?
There is a seat behind you, Mrs. Carline.
Thank you, but without a cushion, it's easier to stand.
I'm sure a cushion could be found for you, Mrs. Carline.
It's easier to stand.
As you prefer. Mrs. Carline, what did you do with the coupons my client put through your letterbox?
I spent them.
And how much did you manage to save by redeeming these coupons?
Oh, quite a lot sometimes. Once it was nearly more than £2.
Really, that would seem to be quite a saving, one which many people would be glad to make. Why then did you consider Paula Carline's giving them to you to be an insult?
We're not paupers.
But these things were helping you to save money. Surely they were useful.
Yes, well, she thinks she's poor because of the maintenance I get. If she wants money saved, why doesn't she save it herself?
Is that what you told Paula Carline when you found her at your doorstep?
No, I told her to go away. I told her not to bring me any more.
Were those the words you used?
I've said I don't remember the words I used.
But the tenor of them was as you've said.
Yes, I told her to stop bothering me.
That's not a very pleasant remark to make to somebody who is trying to help you, is it, Mrs. Carline?
I didn't consider that she was trying to help me.
Then, at your next meeting at the Loderia shoe shop, you chose to ignore her.
I did not ignore her.
But you told the court, I didn't think there was anything to say.
That's true. I didn't have anything to say to her.
Wouldn't you have been upset if on meeting you, Paula Carline had ignored you?
Unfortunately, she doesn't ignore me. I wish she would. You've seen the results.
Yes, well, we'll come to that later. So, by the beginning of March, there was quite a lot of animosity between you and my client.
We weren't particularly friendly. I wouldn't call it animosity.
What would you call it? Or could you put into words the state of affairs as they existed between you and my client at the beginning of March?
I just couldn't trust her to behave well.
You expected her to behave badly?
I didn't say that. I couldn't expect her to behave well.
Isn't the opposite of behaving well behaving badly, Mrs. Carline?
She's behaved badly before.
And therefore you expected her to behave badly again?
She didn't behave badly in the off-license. She behaved appallingly.
That is for the prosecution to try and prove, Mrs. Carline. Let us now turn our attention to that meeting in the Van Ordinaire. Is the Van Ordinaire a large shop?
It's quite small.
Mm-hmm. What happens when you enter the shop?
I'm sorry.
I mean, is there a bell or anything to indicate to the shopkeeper that someone has just entered the shop?
Oh, yes, there's a bell, but it's not really necessary. You can see anybody that comes in.
Well, but you have just said that you didn't see my client enter the shop.
I did not see her come in.
But how can you explain your statement that you can see anybody that enters the shop?
If you're behind the counter, you can. I was facing the wrong way.
Did you know someone had entered the shop behind you?
Yes, well, I knew somebody had come in.
Yet you didn't glance round to see who it was?
Why should I have done?
Well, a curiosity, Mrs. Carline?
I was involved in conversation.
So, you didn't see my client had entered the shop until you had finished your conversation?
That's right.
And when you did see her?
Nothing. I finished writing my check.
Mrs. Carline, what did you do after you'd finished signing your check?
I picked everything up, except I forgot a packet of peanuts. God, I wish I hadn't.
Don't let's get ahead of ourselves. So, you picked up everything in your arms, or did you have a carrier?
In my arms. The Van Ordinaire's too mean to supply free carriers. And I don't see why I should pay for the privilege of advertising for them. I mean, I'd spent nearly £25.
So, you were carrying in your arms all you had bought, except for a packet of peanuts?
Yes.
Why didn't you pick the peanuts up?
Well, I was in a hurry to get out of the shop.
Why were you in a hurry to get out of the shop?
I wanted to get home to my children.
You didn't want to get away from Paula Carline as fast as you could.
Well, I didn't want to stay in the shop any longer than necessary.
So you were in a hurry to avoid her?
My children were at home by themselves. I wanted to get home.
What did you do when you realized you had forgotten the peanuts?
Nothing. I didn't think it was worth the trouble of going back for.
What do you mean by trouble, Mrs. Carline?
Paula was standing at the counter.
But why did you expect trouble?
Because there's always trouble when we meet.
Mrs. Carline, you cannot construe the events on other occasions as being trouble.
They trouble me.
So, there was a split second in which you wondered whether or not to go back for the peanuts.
Yes.
In which you might have paused.
I might have done.
Indicating that you had forgotten something.
I don't know if I paused.
You've just told the court that you might have done.
Yes, well, only for a split second.
But enough to indicate that you had forgotten the nuts.
Well, I don't know. I could have stopped for any reason.
So you did stop?
I don't mean stopped, I mean paused.
So why might you have paused when leaving the Van Ordinaire?
Well, something on the shelves might have caught my eye.
But surely you would have examined the shelves while deciding what to buy.
Well, I might have done. I was probably looking to see where I was going.
Why did you have to look where you were going?
Well, one usually does if one doesn't want to trip over anything.
Were there obstacles in your path to the door?
Yes.
What obstacles were there between the counter and the door?
There was a large basket. It had legs that went out like that. Oh, it had all the remainder stock in it. And then there was a tiered basket thing. It had... Oh, it's so difficult to describe. It was full of crisps and things.
There was nothing else?
I don't think so, no.
There wasn't perhaps a window display or anything?
Oh, yes, yes. That's where the beer was. It was in sort of stacks, in separate pyramids. And then it had a rope around it, I suppose, to stop it from being stolen. The rope was like this, you know, like the kind they have in stately homes to stop people walking across the carpets.
Can you describe to the court the way in which the rope around the bier was anchored to the floor?
I'm sorry,
But the rope around the bier must have been supported in some way.
Oh, yes. It was on 2 stands. And then at the top of the stand there was a hole where the rope passed through.
And were these supports freestanding or fixed?
Well, they must have been freestanding because I knocked one over when I fell.
How close to the door was the support you knocked over as you fell?
Next to it.
So, next to the door was a freestanding support with a rope carried through the top of it.
Yes.
Mrs. Carline, will you now tell the court in your own words? Now, you have in your arms an identical collection of bottles to the ones which you purchased at the Van Ordinaire.
Yes.
It's quite a load, isn't it?
It's what I was carrying.
But you would admit that it's quite an armful.
Yeah, well, I was only carrying them to the car.
Mrs. Carline, please, answer the question. Are your arms full?
I suppose so.
And carrying such a burden, it must have been quite difficult to see where you were going.
Do you think I could put them down, please?
I have not made my point yet, Mrs. Carline.
Your Honour, we have already heard of the difficulty my client has had holding things since her accident. I think we can all now understand how much she was carrying. May she please put down her burden?
Unless you intend to start throwing packets of peanuts around, Mr. Fletcher Reed, which I can assure you I won't allow. I see no reason why Mrs. Carline should not be relieved of the bottles.
I have a very important point I should like to make first, Your Honour.
Then please make it as quickly as possible.
Mrs. Carline, can you see your feet?
I'm sorry.
Burdened as you are, can you see your feet?
No.
Thank you. Will you please relieve Mrs. Carline of her burden?
Thank you.
Will you return to the witness box, Mrs. Carline?
Mrs. Carline, it must have been difficult to negotiate your way from the counter to the door, burdened as you were.
Not really.
Didn't you have any trouble seeing where you were going?
No.
But you couldn't see your feet.
I could see in front of me, though.
You were watching where you were going.
Of course I was.
Then how do you account for the fact that one of the stands around the bier was knocked over?
That happened when I fell. I caught my foot in it.
So you caught your foot in one of the stands?
Yes.
Before the peanuts were thrown?
No.
I put it to you, Mrs. Carline, that in your haste to leave the shop, you were not looking where you were going.
No.
And that because you were not looking where you were going, you caught your foot in one of the supports, and that the resulting accident was caused by your own haste. A classic example, would you not say, of that old proverb, festina lente, more haste, less speed.
That is not true. I tripped because she threw a packet of peanuts at me.
At you, Mrs. Carline?
At me.
You don't think that perhaps my client noticed the peanuts which you had forgotten in your hurry and threw them to you so that you could take them with you?
She threw them at me.
Mrs. Carline, you say my client was standing at the counter which was behind you?
She was.
Do you have eyes in the back of your head?
No.
Then how could you possibly have seen whether she threw the peanuts to you or at you?
The shop has a glass-fronted door. I could see her reflection in it.
If you were so intent on watching Paula Carline's reflection in the glass of the door, then how could you possibly have been able to see where you were going? Well, Mrs. Carline? No further questions, Your Honour.
Mrs. Carline, whereabouts were you in the shop when the nuts were thrown?
I was at the door.
You were at the door, not approaching it.
I was at the door. I had my hand free to open it.
And it was at that moment that Paula Carline threw the nuts?
Yes, she did.
Did she give you any indication at all she was going to throw them?
Yes. She shouted, "There."
You're quite sure she shouted there and not here?
Quite sure. She was throwing them at me. There was a lot of force behind them.
And you could see all this reflected in the glass door of the shop?
Yes.
What was your reaction to the nuts being thrown?
I tried to avoid them, but they hit me. My head.
Can you remember what happened when they hit you?
I lost my grip. I could feel the bottles falling. I tried to hold on to them, but I caught my foot.
You caught your foot as a result of the nuts being thrown?
I tripped, trying to not let go of the bottles.
But you lost hold of the bottles as a result of the nuts being thrown?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell the court how much time elapsed from the moment you left the counter and the moment you fell?
A few seconds, not much more.
But time enough to separate the events.
Yes. I crossed the shop. I paused to open the door. She threw the nuts at me. Because she threw them, I tripped.
And the court has been made well aware of the results of that trip. Thank you, Mrs. Carline. I have no further questions, Your Honour. You are Eunice Gilbert?
Yes.
And you live above the Vin Ordinaire, off licence on Claremont Crescent?
You've got to now. I wouldn't risk having a lock-up the way things are going.
And were you working there on the night of the 17th of March this year?
Of course. I've had too many shop assistants to risk taking on another pilferer.
Did something happen in your shop on the night of the 17th?
Happen? I'm surprised I've got any of my shop left.
Yes, well, we'll